An inch of topsoil left isn't very much. I mean, on our farm here, since Europeans came, depending on who you talk to, we've lost anywhere from 3 to 5 feet of soil. I just returned from a week in Israel, and boy, you talk about a loss of soil. I mean, that whole region is just nothing but rocks. Of course, they've abused it for a lot longer than we've abused it here. The truth is that the soil, of course, is the Earth's womb. I mean, and it's our womb as well. As the soil health and wealth goes, so goes the health and wealth of the nation. And you study through history, the Greeks, the Romans, the Indians, the Mongols. I mean, all these cultures rose and fell on the back of their soil. And so, it behooves us to, at the end of the day, maintaining healthy soil is more important than maintaining a healthy Wall Street any time of day. And so how do we do that, and what's going on? Well, what's going on is, first of all, tillage. And so if you look at natural systems, natural ecology, what you see is very few annuals. You see primarily perennials that don't need planting all the time. And because the planting all the time, the annuals requires some sort of tillage or breaking the prairie, breaking the vegetative cover. So as you begin breaking that perennial cover, you expose the soil to the washing, to the raindrops. I mean, raindrops hitting bare soil are like bombs. They're hitting it at 80 miles an hour, and they make these little craters in the soil. You've seen them after a rain, little craters in the soil. And so the soil needs to be covered, and nature doesn't till, nature doesn't plow. So we are violating, and it's one thing to do a little bit, to have your garden, to do a little bit of tillage on something, but to do it on the kind of scale that we're doing. Now, I can hear people say, well, if we don't do it at scale, we can't feed everybody. Oh, yes, we can. The first thing is there's no reason to feed herbivores grain. And 30% of all the grain grown on the planet goes through herbivores: sheep, goats, cows, both beef cows and dairy cows. They're not supposed to eat any grain at all. So then you start pecking away at the grain acreage that we need, and then you realize, well, if we hooked up all of our food wastes to chickens, then we could have all of our eggs without having any grain as well, because the chickens would eat food scraps, which is what they did throughout history. We don't have to now have the grain for that. And then you take the pigs, and the pigs then can fatten in our forests where there's, nuts and all sorts of things that drop, and again, reduce grain. So the fact is, grain production, I'll just throw out a number, is probably, it could be reduced by 70% if we started integrating our systems instead of segregating, and if we started leveraging perennials instead of eliminating perennials and substituting with annuals. And the single biggest way to erode soil is to make it naked, and to take that vegetative cover off, which is what's required for growing grain. Right now, a bushel of corn costs us, I think it's 2 bushels of soil. You can't keep doing that. We've got a dead zone the size of Rhode Island in the Gulf of Mexico, primarily from soil washing off. And the final thing about maintaining resilient soil is organic matter. And we've dropped in the U.S. We've dropped, and I think this is pretty much North America wide. Organic matter in our soils has dropped from somewhere around 6 to 7% down to 1%. And organic matter is the sponge of the soil. That's decomposing vegetation, and that's what makes it soft and spongy, be able to absorb water, to be able to hold an aggregate like a chocolate cake. Good soil should look like a chocolate cake. It shouldn't look like like concrete. And so maintaining that organic matter is critical. So I can just use in the U.S. here. If we took all the biomass that burns, that we spend $5 billion, in fighting all these forest fires, and we chipped all that biomass and used it for composting, and substituted instead of buying any chemical fertilizer, instead we go to a carbon economy, biomass driven with decomposition. We would not only create an incredible number of jobs for people who enjoy working outside and want to do something with their hands, we would eliminate dependency on Putin and and petroleum-based chemical fertilizer, and we would actually build organic matter in soil, which is more productive and less susceptible to erosion, and we would start building soil instead of losing soil. So, and ultimately that means we would build cultural wealth instead of depleting cultural wealth, which ultimately goes back to the wealth of the soil. The plow has done, more damage than just about anything. And I mean, just think about this. When Ed Faulkner wrote Plowman's Folly in 1950, imagine a book by the title Plowman's Folly. He sold like 500,000 copies of that book in less than a year. And it was a runaway bestseller. Of course, in that day we had 10 times as many farmers as we do today, so the audience was a lot bigger. But we've known the devastation of the plow for a long time, but we're addicted to a fundamentally segregated, grain-based, convenience-oriented production system and a cheap food system. Let me just say that if you're committed to a cheap food system, you're never going to get ecological integrity. The only way to get ecological integrity is to have a fair-priced food policy, not a cheap food price policy. And I get real aggressive about this. People talk about prices, say, look, we've got the cheapest food on the planet here. Why? Because all our costs are built in. We're not putting on society externalized costs. Half of all cases of diarrhea are caused by foodborne bacteria. Well, what's a case of diarrhea worth? I don't know, but it's probably worth something. And if the food system started bearing the brunt of the cost of erosion, of dead zones, of infertile frogs, three-legged salamanders, diarrhea, MRSA, C. diff, superbugs. If the food system started bearing those costs, very quickly we'd find out that food priced the way our farm prices food is actually the cheapest food on the planet. Especially then when you start looking at the nutrition of it. If you start saying, well, good night, I've got to eat 25 supermarket eggs to get the same folic acid as I get in one of your eggs, suddenly that makes our 50% price premium look like peanuts. As far as I know, it's strictly avian influenza, and I know that there is pushback on that from people that are, these companies are gouging in prices and all that. But I think it's important to understand that eggs are a highly perishable product, and so as you move toward perishability, you have an unusually close relationship between supply and demand. Supply and demand on, I don't know what, let's just take, motor oil. Motor oil supply and demand can be pretty far apart. There's a lot of room for adjustment. If suddenly there's a run on motor oil, there's a lot of room for adjustment before you run out, because inventories can be really, really high due to the fact that it's a non-perishable product. But when you come to eggs, they're so highly perishable that the supply and demand has very little wiggle room. In other words, the eggs coming in have to be very, very reflective of the eggs being purchased. And so with eggs, with something like this that's a real tight supply-demand issue because of perishability, a glitch in supply of even 3%. I mean, so there's 100 people that want a dozen eggs. if suddenly there's only 96 dozen instead of 100 dozen, those 96 dozen eggs are not just going to go up 4% because there's a 4% shortage. No, they're going to go way up because everybody is scrambling for those 96 dozen eggs. Those 100 customers are scrambling for those 96 dozen eggs. In other things, canned things, breakfast cereals, there's a much bigger inventory pipeline because they're not as perishable. So little glitches in supply don't show up as quickly. Eggs, it shows up quicker, and it's demonstrably a bigger hiccup in the system because of the perishability of the product.
That's interesting. And what is your take on avian influenza, like with respect to the outbreak, the seriousness of it, and how they're going to go about dealing with it? Because by the sounds of things, they're trying to vaccinate billions of chickens or something.
Yeah. Well, you can be assured that there will be a mechanical view toward life, just like we've done with everything else, and the faith is being put on human cleverness to be able to come up with concoctions faster than microbes and viruses can adapt, and that's not a bet you want to take.